Hi, my name is Brad, and this is episode 5 in a YouTube lecture series about intonation in English called Listening for Meaning. In the previous 2 episodes, I introduced 2 central concepts for this series from systemic functional linguistics, termed metafunction and stratification. In this episode, I introduce another theoretical concept in SFL, rank, which is concerned with constituency relations between units of language. As I mentioned before, these theoretical concepts provide an essential foundation for the lectures I present in this series. In the previous episode, I discussed the metafunctional perspective on intonation, saying in relation to this slide, quote, "The metafunctional profile also enables us to distinguish the tone contours as interpersonal from the varying pitch levels as textual, resolving the long-running debate in the literature about whether intonational phenomena consist of a series of contours or levels." End quote. In this episode, I show how this metafunctional perspective is also essential in distinguishing intonation choices at different ranks. So this debate, whether intonation should be seen as pitch levels or contours, goes back at least as far as the 1951 paper by Dwight Bollinger in Word Journal, titled Intonation Levels versus Configurations, and is roughly aligned with, respectively, American and European approaches to intonation study. Robert Ladd, in a 1978 paper in Language Journal, referred to, quote, "the old debate about levels versus configurations. Since Bollinger first raised the question explicitly in 1951, there has been considerable argument over whether intonation is better described as pitch contours, like the kinetic tones of the British tradition, or as a sequence of pitch phonemes or significant levels, the American approach." End quote. As always, all these works are referenced in the description for this video. As the above quote from Ladd shows, the debate on whether intonation should be studied as contours or levels continued well into the 1970s. Bollinger also, in his introduction chapter to a 1972 edited volume of papers on intonation, wrote, quote, "There is wide agreement among linguists on the units of sound that make distinctions in word meanings. There is no such agreement on the units of intonation. Some have argued that an intonation contour consists of a succession of levels, others that it is a succession of changes in direction." End quote. It is interesting here also to note the reference to distinctions in word meanings as criterion for determining the units of sound that make those distinctions. This contrasts with the form before function approach I discussed in the previous episode. The other quote in this slide, also from the 1978 Ladd paper, also reveals a functional approach to intonation study, referring to the goal of reaching an understanding of how intonation really functions in language. In the earlier quote from Ladd about pitch phonemes, while he adds that these pitch phonemes could also be referred to as significant levels, in the same paper he writes, for some reason in upper caps, "The phonemes are contours." SFL transitivity buffs might say he is trying here to indicate an encoding identifying clause. That is, for Ladd in this paper, in terms of intonation, the analogous phonological unit to the phoneme for intonation is the pitch contour type, whether rising or falling, etc., rather than the pitch level. Ladd's conclusions in this 1978 paper are also interesting in terms of the historical development of intonation studies. Quote, "It seems to me that because autosegmental theory and its current formalisms were developed in great part on the basis of Africanist tone languages, where contours probably can best be seen as sequences of levels, some of the questions it asks are simply inapplicable to languages like Chinese or English, where contours are atomic rather than compound." Ladd concludes by referring to, quote, "the inadequacy of any approach to English intonation which treats contours as sequences of significant pitch levels." End quote. Nevertheless, as I showed in the previous episode, by the publication of his influential 1996 book, Ladd clearly prefers a segmental view on intonation as a sequence of pitch levels, following work by Pierre Humbert and others in this tradition. And as Ladd observed elsewhere, as also quoted last episode, the segmental pitch levels approach has become, quote, unquestionably the currently dominant approach to intonational description, end quote. However, this debate, seemingly settled through the academic dominance of one approach, is in fact based on a failure to differentiate the two types of meaning, interpersonal and textual, and their expression in sound that I've been outlining in previous episodes. Pitch contours realise prosodic interpersonal meanings, whereas pitch levels realise periodic textual meanings. That is, in SFL, it is not that pitch levels or contours are the same phenomenon, as seen through the lens of different theoretical approaches. Instead, they are in fact different phenomena. From the perspective of the SFL theory of metafunction, they are complementary ways of making meanings of different kinds, just as there are complementary choices made within the clause in different metafunctions. This distinction between pitch levels and contours also enables us to distinguish the two main units of intonation, the foot and the tone group. Pitch contours are associated with the tone group, while variations in pitch levels are associated with the foot. Thus, each tone group has one pitch contour, rising, falling, etc., including both complex rising-falling contours and the compound tones, example the falling plus level rise contour that I discussed previously. Each foot has one salient syllable, as indicated usually by a jump up in pitch, but sometimes by the syllable's place in an established rhythm. I'll come back to this later. These two units, the tone group and the foot, thus form different ranks for intonation in English. So it is essential in the SFL approach to intonation to distinguish units at the different ranks within what Halliday called the rank scale. Rank is another important theoretical concept in SFL to account for the hierarchy of different units within which particular systems and structures are located. Whereas stratification theorises different levels of abstraction in language related by the principle of expression or realisation, rank theorises a hierarchy of units within language related by the principle of constituency. So units at one rank, for example the clause, are composed of units at the lower rank, for example groups and phrases, while the lower rank units form part of the higher ranked unit as its constituents. Groups and phrases are part of a clause. Groups and phrases in turn are made up of words which are in turn constituted by morphemes. And at a higher rank, clauses combine as constituents of the clause complex rank. For intonation, the basic units of the rank scale are, in descending order in the rank hierarchy, the tone group, the foot, and the syllable. And as with the clause complex, Halliday also posited a higher rank, the tone group complex, composed of tone groups. Tone groups are composed of, as constituents, feet, and feet are composed of syllables. For some, the phoneme is considered a rank below the syllable. But for intonational phonology, within the rank of a syllable, I find it is more helpful to talk about the structure of a syllable, which consists of an onset nucleus coda structure, or more simply, onset rhyme. This syllable structure, particularly the location of the nucleus, is more useful in analysing salience and rhythm, whereas the phoneme plays little or no role in intonation analysis. I think the phoneme is more related to the experiential meanings of the clause rather than the interpersonal and textual meanings realised by intonation choices within the tone group. As with the clause, where certain systems and structures are at group rank and others are at clause rank, so too with intonation. The different ranks of tone group and foot have different systems and structures assigned to each. Tonicity and tone systems are part of the tone group, while salience is a system of the foot. I will come back to discuss tonality, rhythm and supersalience in terms of rank in a later episode. It is tonality and rhythm, in fact, that determine the units of intonation. Each unit also has its own structure. In the tone group there is a structure of optional pre-tonic followed by the tonic syllable with optional post-tonic syllables. In the foot there is a structure of salient syllable followed by optional non-salient syllables. In Halliday's terms, the salient syllable is called the ictus, while non-salient syllables are called remiss syllables. I talked last episode about the expression used by David Butt of knowing one's semiotic address, where in the theory you are describing or analysing particular phenomena. It is important in spoken discourse analysis to assign one's analyses also to the appropriate rank. Distinguishing salience from tonicity in particular, and from supersalience, is one of the most important and difficult aspects of phonological analysis of intonation, which I will continue to address throughout this series, providing practice and tips on how to identify choices at each rank. But as always when studying intonation, it is best to return to actual spoken text and listen to these phenomena as sound, which we can do in this forum of YouTube, unlike in a writing-based textbook. Let's go back to the full LAD example dialogue, which I used last episode to illustrate the expression of interpersonal meanings, and consider it now in terms of textual meanings. I have removed the punctuation here. The written punctuation is redundant once we have our intonational transcription, here from a spoken version of these lines that I have performed. This transcription is far more reliable and informative than punctuation, representing the significant phonological choices derived from our description of intonation systems. I'll come back to discuss punctuation and the representation of intonation in writing in a later episode. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. Sue? A driving instructor? So in terms of textual choices, the words containing the salient syllables are Sue, course, driving, Sue, driving, and instructor. And note, as mentioned previously, firstly, that it is the primary stressed syllable in each word that carries the salience, hence shown in italics, and secondly, that tonic syllables are also salient. The words containing the tonic syllables are driving, Sue, and driving. As illustrated in previous lectures, the best way to explore intonation choices, their functions and expression, is to vary the choices and see what happens to the sound and meaning. Here is another version of the LAD dialogue with different textual choices of salience, supersalience, and tonicity. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. Sue? A driving instructor? I've also put the earlier version, which I'm calling version 1, below for easy reference. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. Sue? A driving instructor? So in version 2, here is now supersalient and Sue is non-salient, or as Halliday termed it, remiss. Instructor is now tonic in both moves instead of driving. These differences between these two versions are textual choices expressed as relative prominences of salience, supersalience, and tonicity. I will now go through these different choices in some more detail using Praat images to illustrate their analysis and then compare their discourse functions in the two versions. Here is a Praat image of the opening move in version 1 of the LAD dialogue as spoken by me. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. There are 3 Praat tiers in this image, a word tier, a foot tier, and a tone group tier. Above these tiers is the spectrogram showing frequency variations, with the blue line approximating fundamental frequency or pitch. And above that, the waveform representation, both of which can be useful in identifying the boundaries of the units I have annotated in the tiers. I'm currently working on a separate episode in this series providing a basic introduction to using Praat. So if you are interested in learning how to use Praat for intonation study, keep an eye out for that episode. As I mentioned, a crucial aspect of intonation analysis within the SFL approach is identifying the different ranks and assigning accurately the boundaries of the units. So in this instance, pictured in this Praat diagram, the first two words I hear are non-salient or remiss in Halliday's terminology. The first salient syllable is su. Note that the foot boundary is placed precisely where the voicing of the vowel sound in su begins, and that the word tier thus doesn't align with the foot tier. I have found that for the most accurate location of foot boundaries, it is best to place the boundary where the nucleus begins, that is, where the vowel voicing begins in each syllable. This is perceptually the event that we perceive as salient in the speech stream. And I have found that rhythms in speech, in particular rhythmic isochrony, the roughly consistent spacing of salient syllables forming a recognizable rhythm, are anchored at the beginning of each syllable nucleus, the voice part of the syllable. Thus for su, this word begins with the unvoiced s sound, but if you want to accurately locate the foot boundary should begin at the moment that the voicing and pitch begins. Likewise for course, the next salient syllable, the foot boundary is placed where the vowel sound begins, not with the initial consonant k sound. Both su and course have a distinct jump up in pitch. It is these jumps up in pitch on these syllables that signal the choice of salient for these syllables. The next salient syllable is also the one that begins the tonic pitch contour, the primary stress syllable in driving. You can hear that the falling pitch contour begins on this syllable. In fact, it actually rises slightly at first, which is well represented in this Praat image in the blue line. But despite this visual representation, this rise is not sufficient to indicate a rise-fall tone 5 contour. A tone 5 contour would sound like this. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. The slight rise for the tone 1 here is just an artifact of the speaker expressing tonicity on this syllable through beginning the tonic contour. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. I will come back in a later episode to discuss how to distinguish different tones from each other, including tones 1 and 5. Importantly, by using one's ears, but also by understanding another important principle of SFL theory, the systemic principle. Choices are either one or the other out of the systemic potential within each system. So this final tonic contour on the word driving is distinct from the earlier salient syllables with their pitch jumps up. Here, the pitch doesn't just change its level as a jump up to a higher level. It enacts a distinctive falling contour shape that catches the ear in a way that pitch jumps don't. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. Thus, the occurrence of a pitch contour, as I mentioned previously, is a distinct auditory phenomenon, and thus an additional level of vocal prominence above that of salience. In this sense, although I have derived much of my understanding of the textual aspects of intonation from the work by Theo van Leeuwen, I depart from his approach, which separates out the interpersonal and textual aspects of intonation entirely in the phonology. In my own understanding, based on Halliday's approach, while a pitch contour realises an interpersonal choice in terms of the type of contour, rising, falling, etc., simultaneously the presence of a contour, regardless of the pitch contour type, expresses a textual choice at the same time. Thus, in this approach, there is a mapping of interpersonal and textual choices together within the tone group, which is analogous to, and indeed alongside, the mapping of interpersonal, textual and experiential meanings together within the clause. Nevertheless, as I explore in later episodes, Halliday's synthetic approach to interpersonal and textual intonational phonology tended to lead to certain textual aspects being overlooked or undervalued in the description. In particular, rhythm and salience as semigenic forces are underexplored in Halliday's description. Van Leuven's separation of textual and interpersonal phenomena enabled a dedicated focus on the discourse functions of the textual metafunction in speech, and has been immensely productive in revealing much that is missing in Halliday's account. This separation of the textual and interpersonal has also informed, I believe, his immensely influential work in multimodal discourse studies across modalities such as gesture, images, film, etc., such as his very early paper shown in this slide from 1985. My first meeting with Bill Greaves in mid-2005 at a cafe in Manly in Sydney was a very enthusiastic discussion about Theo van Leuven's approach to rhythm and salience, and afterwards Bill sent me a copy of Van Leuven's Speech, Music, Sound through the post. From my observation in Bill's last years, he dedicated considerable time to the study of rhythm and salience. His chapter in the volume Systemic Phonology, edited by Wendy Boucher and myself, shown in this slide, is a good example of the insights that result from a dedicated attention to the textual intonation choices in spoken texts. Considering separately textual aspects of intonation also enables us to draw upon the rich body of work viewing intonation as pitch levels. For example, the influential work by Janet Pierre Humbert and Julia Hirschberg, shown in this slide, on the discourse meanings of intonation. Knowing one's semiotic address also applies to consideration of such work from outside of SFL, in order to understand how that work might be incorporated into SFL spoken discourse studies. There is much to be learnt from the tradition of work on pitch levels in terms of the SFL study of textual choices in spoken discourse. Here is version 2 of the first line of the LAD text, with here as supersalient instead of salient, and with instructor, not driving, as tonic. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. Note that I use SS here in the Praat tone group tier at the bottom to represent supersalience. As I've mentioned before, the Praat visualization can sometimes be helpful, but sometimes not helpful, or worse, misleading. In this image, you can clearly see, for example, the extreme jump up in pitch on here in the blue line representation as supersalience, although this could be misinterpreted as a tonic contour. Meanwhile, the expression of the tonic contour on instructor is not well represented. As I mentioned before, for intonation analysis, while Praat can be helpful in some respects, such as to help in identifying the boundaries of units, I recommend just to use your ears to learn how to identify intonation choices from the sound alone. We do this thousands of times a day in everyday conversation. The trick is to make that unconscious knowledge, which we have from infancy, conscious. This image of version 1 of the reply in the LAD text we are already familiar with from the previous episode. Sue, a driving instructor? The first tone group, which is one syllable, Sue, is assigned both the interpersonal choice of this tone, the tone 2 plus rise, fall, rise contour, and tonicity, with the presence of this pitch contour assigning textual prominence to this word. That is, as mentioned earlier, textual and interpersonal meanings are mapped together within the same tone group and, in this instance, the same syllable. This same tone 2 plus is repeated in the second part of this move, but now the same contour is stretched out across the two words, driving instructor, with the tonic contour beginning on the first syllable of the first word, driving, thus treating this noun group as a compound noun, like blackboard or dog food. In such a compound noun, the default or unmarked location for the tonic contour is thus to begin on the primary stressed syllable of the first word. Note again in this slide how the foot boundary is located at the beginning of the vowel sound in the nucleus of the syllable su, and not at the beginning of the word. The spectrogram and waveform are actually quite useful in this regard, as one can clearly see a differentiation between the sibilants of the initial unvoiced consonant s, and the beginning of the vowel sound, su. The blue line representing pitch is also quite a good representation of the first of the two-tone contours here, but for the second contour, the final rise is represented as though it is a separate pitch contour, when in fact, as spoken, it is clearly heard as continuous, as the same rise-fall-rise contour as on su. Su? A driving instructor? Instrumental analysis in this respect can be worse than unreliable. It can actually be misleading. Here is version 2 of the reply with instructor, not driving, as tonic. Su, a driving instructor? The differences between these two versions, as differences in meaning, can more easily be compared in table format. And note again, as mentioned before, that the tonic syllables are also salient syllables. I will come back to discuss the functions of textual choices of intonation in more detail in later episodes, but briefly, in version 1, su is salient, so there is some textual prominence assigned to this grammatical subject. In some sense, this move is about su. In version 2, instead of su, the first salient syllable is for the word here, which is actually assigned supersalience, making this verb a new topic theme in the discourse, or what Halliday calls a new hypertheme in the conversation. And su is non-salient in the second version, or remiss in Halliday's terminology. We can say that this second version is initiating a new topic in the discourse about something speaker one has heard about, while su is being taken for granted in the discourse in this version. We could imagine that perhaps the speakers had previously been talking about su leading up to this exchange. Whereas in version 1, the tonic in the first move and the second tone group of the reply is driving, in version 2, it is the primary stressed second syllable of the word instructor. As mentioned, version 1 treats driving instructor as a compound noun like apple tree or washing machine. Although having two words, they are treated as one thing, with the tonic falling on the primary stressed syllable in the first word. However, in version 2, speaker 1 and then speaker 2 in reply make instructor carry the tonic syllable, thus making this word the focus of their respective moves. The effect is to make the discourse focus on the fact that Sue is learning to be an instructor, rather than about her training to teach driving. That is why speaker 2 follows suit after speaker 1 makes instructor the focus, continuing the textual focus also on instructor. It would be counter-expectant if in version 2 if speaker 2 had replied with the tonic focus on driving, as in the first version. Because the default is for this noun group driving instructor to be treated as a single unit of meaning, as a compound noun, this focus on the second word instructor is in fact a mark choice, even though it is the final lexical item. Halliday's useful formula for markedness in tonicity choice is for it to fall on the final lexical item, but the underlying principle is in fact one related to what is the default, the one used unless there is a good reason, rather than the position. In version 2, the marked focus on the word instructor has the implication, therefore, that there is something noteworthy about Sue taking on this teaching role. And as always, this is the meaning that we hear when we listen to this move. The different textual intonation choices, in particular the different choices of tonic focus, make these two versions different texts. They are about different things. I will go into more detail in coming episodes about the workings of the textual metafunction in spoken language, showing how such choices function to take a conversational discourse in particular directions based on these points of textual focus, and are in fact crucial in weaving together different meanings into what we call a text as a coherent unity relevant to some context. So just a couple of additional points about rank. As I've said, distinguishing between between salience and tonicity, between pitch level variations and pitch contour types, is an essential task in the SFL approach to intonation. My teacher Bill Greaves advised me at that first meeting in mid-2005 to always conduct the salience and rhythm analysis first before any other intonation analysis, which advice of course I initially ignored until some days later I finally relented and then found out he was right. This often involves getting a sense of the regularized rhythms of a text. We don't always speak in anything like metronomic time, but then we also don't always pronounce our phonemes or words very carefully. But people are still able to understand what we are intending to mean in both cases. So we tend towards established rhythms through alternations of salient and non-salient syllables at roughly spaced intervals, even though the spacings between salient syllables are not necessarily precisely regular or isochronic, as in the example in this slide. The rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain. Where such a regular rhythm is established, there is often an increased redundancy in the phonetic expression of salience. It is a general principle in phonological analysis that the more expected a choice is, the less phonetic expression is required to make that choice. So where there is an established rhythm, the salient syllables don't require as much sound expression to be heard as maintaining that established rhythm. I will talk again later in this series about the importance of redundancy in phonological analysis, in particular in relation to what I termed earlier the systemic principle. This idea of redundancy in the study of intonation was first proposed to me as being of interest during my honours year by my supervisor Ron DeFay, and I haven't forgotten. The corollary is true also. Where there is a mark choice in the discourse, example, a mark choice of tonic focus, there tends to be some excess in the phonetic expression as the speaker works against the listener's expectation. I just did it now with the mark choice of focus on against in my previous tone group. Such considerations are essential foundations for the analytical process for intonational study. Finally, here is a transcription of my pronunciation of the title slide in terms of intonation choices to illustrate the analytical distinction between supersalience and tonicity. Listening for meaning. Here there is one tone group with supersalience on the first syllable of listening, with tonic contour on meaning. However, as I was reaching up to start this move on the first syllable at the high pitch level for supersalience, this makes it sound a bit like I was expressing a tone 2, a rising contour, as a tonic. It is easy to confuse these choices, supersalience and tonicity, in terms of whether it's actually supersalience or a rising pitch contour for tone 2. But here is an alternative version of the title, one that does have a tonic contour on listening, with two tone groups in sequence, a rising tone 2 followed by a tone 1. This is how that sounds. Listening for meaning. In this second version, the two tone contours are separated by a pause, a silent beat after the first tone contour, which makes clear that this is to be taken as two tone groups, not one. In the second version, the speaker who wishes to make listening a separate tone group thus has to do some work in terms of the rhythm, adding a pause before the second tone group to make clear that the first rising pitch is in fact a tonic contour and not, as in the first version, supersalience. And as the choice of two tone groups in sequence here for this title is a marked choice, thus the silent beat or pause after the first tonic rising contour is an example of what I was just talking about, of the need to clearly express a marked choice in some obvious way on the expression plane. That's what the rhythm and the pause is doing. And as always, we can hear the different meanings being expressed through these two versions. Version 1 introduces a new hypertheme through salience for a single tone group move. Version 2, with two contours on the two main lexical items, makes each of these thus a separate point of textual focus. Listening for meaning. Listening for meaning. As mentioned in an earlier episode, where an analysis of intonation is difficult, speaking the different versions out loud to oneself, as I've been doing here, helps in determining which is the right analysis for the text being studied. We can hear from our two different versions not just how they sound different, but also how they mean different. To finish, just as another follow-up addendum on the previous episode's discussion about the development of linguistics as a science, this slide shows two quotes which I used in my PhD. Firstly, from Halliday, quote, "Those who study language have often been concerned with the status of linguistics as a science. They've wanted to ensure that their work was objective and scientifically valid. The natural way to achieve this aim has been to use other earlier developed sciences as a model: theoretical physics, evolutionary biology, chemistry, some discipline that is currently valued as a leader in the field of intellectual activity." End quote. This accounts for why linguistics in the mid-20th century, as I showed last episode, seemed obsessed with the physical sound signal and instrumental analysis as the only proper basis from which to proceed in studying speech, including intonation studies, what Bloomfield referred to as scientific materialism, disregarding meaning and function as being abstract and thus unreliable. Because these aspiring linguistics scientists were trying to imitate the methods and indeed the data and scope of the physical sciences. As David Butt has often put it, what counts as linguistic evidence. As Butt observes, quote, "American linguistics has constructed itself according to differing pictures of what can and what cannot count as scientific." As I've shown in this and the previous episodes, views on what counts as a valid scientific approach have had a significant influence on intonation studies. For example, in settling the long-running debate over whether intonation consists of a series of pitch contours or levels, in favour of the latter view. I've shown, however, in this episode that, as Kenneth Pike put it in the quotation from the previous episode, it is one's theoretical perspective that determines both what one sees and how one sees it. Thus, from the SFL viewpoint, as shown in this quote from Halliday, the study of phonology, quote, rests on an abstraction from the phonic data in which one has asked simply, is this distinction which I can abstract from observations of the substance meaningful, end quote. The corollary of this is to ask, how is this meaning distinction, which I know as a member of my culture, expressed in what sound distinction? As Ladd wrote, ultimately our aim is to understand and describe how intonation works and functions in making meaning in discourse, regardless of whether one calls that endeavour a scientific one or not. As someone who began my university studies doing an environmental science degree before switching to a Bachelor of Arts, I was happy to find that linguistics sits at the intersection of the sciences and humanities, where my scholarly interests since high school have always sat. This is particularly so for intonation study, which of necessity combines serious attention to both the abstract and the material realms.